The small, fog-laden town of Evergrove hadn't had much excitement in years, but all that changed with the arrival of a single photograph. Detective Evelyn Marks was finishing her shift when Officer Luis handed her a thick, yellowed envelope with her name scrawled across it in old-fashioned ink. She opened it, eyebrows knitting together as she slid out a single black-and-white photograph. Her heart nearly stopped. It was an image of her own house taken from a distance at night. She recognized the house, but something was off. The window lights were dimmed in an unusual way, the silhouette of someone standing inside. Evelyn squinted, barely able to make out the figure, but she could tell it wasn't her. A knock on her office door broke the trance. "Detective, we've got another one," Officer Luis said, his face pale. He handed her another envelope, nearly identical to hers, this time addressed to Emma Downey, a young woman who'd gone missing 2 days earlier. Evelyn tore it open, revealing a photo of Emma's last known location, the corner of Baker and 7th, where security cameras had caught her disappearing into thin air. Evelyn's mind spun. Evergrove hadn't seen a kidnapping or even a missing person in years. Now 2 people had received photographs before their disappearances, Emma and herself. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her face composed, hiding her fear from Luis. "I'll take care of it," she said calmly, slipping both envelopes into her desk. But inside, she was unraveling. She headed to her house, checking every door and window lock. She felt eyes on her as she moved from room to room, as though the walls themselves held secrets. Every corner of her home seemed tinged with the silent horror of that photo. Then her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She didn't answer, but it buzzed again and again. With a sigh, she picked up, expecting silence, but instead there was a soft, whispering voice on the other end, distorted and hollow. "Detective Marks, you can't hide. Not from me." A chill ran down her spine. Before she could respond, the line went dead. She slumped against the wall, phone clutched tightly in her hand, dread washing over her. Who had sent the photo, and who was the shadow lurking in her home? And most haunting of all, was she next? Evelyn barely slept that night. Every creak and whisper of the house seemed amplified, and the silence that followed was like a heavy blanket pressing down on her. She awoke to the sharp ring of her phone, jarring her out of a restless doze. "Detective Marks, it's Luis. There's something you need to see." The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, and Evelyn quickly pulled herself together. Within minutes, she was in her car, heading to Evergrove's main street, where a small crowd had gathered outside the bookstore. As she pushed through the bystanders, she saw what had drawn everyone's attention, a photograph taped to the glass door of the store. It was another black-and-white image. This time it showed a narrow alley, dimly lit and unfamiliar. In the photo's foreground was a figure, partially obscured but unmistakably female. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The figure was Emma Downey. Her heart hammered as she scanned the photo, searching for anything that could give her a clue. Then she noticed something odd. A shadow on the wall, shaped almost like a person, looming over Emma, its form distorted and unnaturally long. The shadow collector, she thought. Luis broke her concentration. It was taped here when the owner opened the shop this morning. No one saw who put it up. "Who else knows?" Evelyn asked. "No one but us and a few early morning customers. I cleared the crowd as best as I could." Evelyn nodded. "Good. I don't want this all over town yet." But inside she felt a rising panic. Whoever the shadow collector was, they were watching, and they wanted her to know it. She drove to the alley from the photo, a forgotten strip of pavement between 2 old brick buildings on the outskirts of town. As she walked down the narrow path, The feeling of being watched returned. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing in on her from all sides. A glint of silver on the ground caught her eye. She knelt down, picking up a delicate chain with a small heart-shaped locket hanging from it. Evelyn recognized it immediately. It belonged to Emma. She clicked it open, revealing a tiny photograph of Emma with her younger sister. The realization hit her like a punch. Emma hadn't just disappeared. She'd been taken. The phone in her pocket buzzed again, another unknown number. Evelyn answered, her voice steely. "Who is this?" A low, whispering voice replied, "You're close, detective, but you're not quick enough." "Where is she?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling with anger. The voice chuckled, a hollow, chilling sound. "She's where the shadows dance. She'll stay there, unless you find her first." The line went dead, and Evelyn stared at her phone, feeling the weight of every second slipping away. Her fingers clenched around the locket as she made a vow to herself. She would bring Emma back. She would face whatever or whoever was behind the shadows, even if it meant facing her deepest fears. With a renewed resolve, she stood and headed back to her car. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was personal now. The shadow collector had made it that way. The clues were thin, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow collector was watching her every move. She spent hours retracing Emma's steps, questioning anyone who might have seen her the night she vanished. But Evergrove was a town that liked its secrets, and the townsfolk had perfected the art of silence. Finally, Evelyn returned to the alley, hoping something would stand out this time. As she scanned the brick walls, she noticed faint scratches near a small grate at the base of the building. She knelt down and examined them closely, realizing they formed letters, haphazard and jagged, as if someone had been in a hurry. "Help," they spelled. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Emma had been here, trapped or desperate enough to carve a message before she was taken. But by whom? Or by what? She rose slowly, taking in the entire alley, and spotted something she'd missed before, a faint smear of red on the edge of the wall, almost hidden beneath the shadows. Blood. Evelyn took a sample and called it in, her mind racing. Whoever was doing this was meticulous, calculated, yet they wanted her to find these breadcrumbs, leading her somewhere dark and twisted. That night, exhausted and haunted by Emma's plight, Evelyn returned home, only to find yet another envelope waiting for her on her front doorstep. She hesitated before picking it up, a knot forming in her stomach. The handwriting was identical to the previous notes, and she knew better than to ignore it. Inside, she found another photograph. This one, however, was different. It was a shot of herself, taken from across the street. She could see herself in her living room window, unaware she was being watched. The sight chilled her to her core. But what really unnerved her was the shadow lurking outside her window in the picture. Its outline was a grotesque blend of human and inhuman, elongated and twisted in impossible angles, as though it was mocking her. Evelyn's phone buzzed again, and she answered without hesitation. Her voice hardened. "Enough games. Where's Emma?" The shadowy voice whispered back, "Closer than you think, detective, but can you find her before I take another?" Her patience snapped. "Who are you?" The voice chuckled. "I am the shadows, Evelyn, and I know your secrets, just as I knew hers." The call ended, and Evelyn sank into a nearby chair, grappling with the realization that whoever or whatever this shadow collector was, they weren't just after Emma. They were coming for her too. But if there was one thing Evelyn Marks knew, it was that she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Evelyn wasn't going to let fear paralyze her. She spent the next morning poring over every piece of evidence she had on Emma, hoping something might reveal why the shadow collector had chosen her as a target. But no connection stood out. Emma was just a regular young woman with no enemies, no criminal history. Frustrated, Evelyn closed her files and glanced at the photograph of herself with the shadow outside her window. She kept turning it over in her mind, analyzing each dark corner of the image. What was the shadow collector trying to tell her? And then it hit her, a detail she had overlooked. She knew that window, that angle, from another life. It was the house she'd grown up in. Her heart pounded as she realized she was being drawn back to her past, one she had left buried in Evergrove's shadows. Her childhood home was in the older, deserted part of town, abandoned for years. The thought of returning there filled her with an eerie dread, but if the shadow collector wanted her to revisit those memories, she'd have to face them. She arrived at the house as dusk fell, casting an eerie light over the decayed wood and shattered windows. Memories rushed back as she pushed open the door, its hinges creaking like a warning. Dust motes floated in the stale air, thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten things. She felt a strange, oppressive sensation settle around her, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets she didn't want to uncover. Slowly, she moved through the rooms, her flashlight sweeping across old, dusty furniture. In the living room, she found another photograph taped to the mirror above the mantel. It was of her as a young girl, sitting alone on the front steps, her expression somber and pensive. In the background, there was that same shadow, looming, distorted, and watching. She had no memory of this moment, or the photograph ever being taken. Then she heard it, a faint sound like a whisper drifting from the back of the house. Her muscles tensed, but she forced herself to follow it, stepping carefully down the hall to her old bedroom. The door stood ajar, and inside, she could see a faint glow from the window, illuminating a small, worn box in the center of the room. She approached it cautiously, kneeling to open it. Inside were remnants of her childhood, a few faded toys, a small journal, and a family photograph she hadn't seen in years. Her parents smiled up at her from the picture, their eyes brimming with warmth and pride. But her gaze lingered on her father, who had passed away when she was young under mysterious circumstances. She'd always been told it was an accident, but there had been whispers, rumors she hadn't fully understood until now. A new piece of paper lay folded at the bottom of the box. She unfolded it, her hands trembling, and read, "Your father knew. He tried to warn you, but you wouldn't remember. They made sure of it." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Evelyn's father. He had known something about this? Something dark enough to haunt her even now. A noise from behind snapped her back to the present. She turned, expecting to see the shadowy figure, but there was nothing. The air around her felt charged, as though the shadows themselves were alive and pressing in. She fled down the hall, clutching the photograph and the note in her hands, her mind racing. Back outside, she glanced at the house one last time, trying to shake the feeling that it was watching her. Whoever the shadow collector was, they were connected to her past, her family, and they were pulling her back into a dark history she'd tried to forget. Now more than ever, she knew this was a personal battle. The shadow collector wasn't just a twisted villain. They were part of her story. And if her father had been involved, Evelyn realized she'd have to confront her own memories to unravel the truth. Back at her apartment, Evelyn sat alone, staring at the photograph of her father and the mysterious note. Questions surged through her mind. What did her father know? And why had he hidden it from her? She had tried so hard to bury her past after his death, but now the shadows were forcing her to confront it. Evelyn spent hours combing through old records, police reports, and family documents, hoping to uncover something, anything, about her father's last days. Eventually, she found an incident report she'd almost forgotten about. A fire at the Evergrove library, reported a few weeks before his death. It was dismissed as accidental, but her father had been obsessed with it, convinced it was intentional. He'd visited the library frequently in those weeks, searching for something he wouldn't talk about. The library had been rebuilt years ago, but a sense of foreboding crept over her as she drove there, feeling as though her father's spirit was guiding her back to the place that had haunted him. When she arrived, the librarian on duty, Mrs. Halley, greeted her with a curious look. "Evelyn Marks, it's been years since I've seen you in here," she said softly, her tone laced with something Evelyn couldn't quite place. "I'm looking into something from the past," Evelyn replied, hesitating. "My father used to come here. Do you remember him?" Mrs. Halley's face grew serious, and she nodded. "Your father was a good man, detective, but he was troubled by something near the end, something he found in the archives. After he passed, we closed off that section of the library for repairs." Truth be told, no one wanted to go down there. It was as if his presence lingered, warning us to stay away. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Is it still closed?" Mrs. Halley hesitated, then handed Evelyn an old iron key. "It's in the basement, just past the old archives. Be careful, detective." The basement was dark and cold, the air thick with dust, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. Evelyn's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of old, forgotten books and documents. She reached the end of the narrow hallway and stopped in front of a heavy iron door. The key fit perfectly, and with a deep breath, she turned it, pushing the door open. Inside, she found stacks of old files, records dating back decades. She sifted through them, her fingers trembling as she unearthed document after document about strange disappearances in Evergrove. Each report shared a common detail. Before each person went missing, they had received a photograph, just like Emma and herself. As she pieced through the files, she discovered another disturbing fact. Every victim had known her father. They were colleagues, friends, even neighbors. A growing dread settled over her as she realized that these disappearances had started long before her father's death, and had only stopped after he passed. But now, they'd begun again, starting with Emma. Then, buried at the bottom of the stack, she found a letter addressed to her, in her father's handwriting. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was still dark, and her heart pounded as she read his words. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I've failed to protect you. There's a darkness in Evergrove, a shadow that feeds on secrets and guilt. I tried to stop it, but I was too late. I could only delay it. Until now. You must finish what I started. Trust no one, and remember, it knows you. It knows everything about you. Don't let it consume you, as it did me." A cold sweat covered Evelyn as she folded the letter, her father's words echoing in her mind. The shadow collector had been lying in wait all these years, and now it was back, with her as its focus. She was certain of one thing. This wasn't just a mystery. It was a battle with something far older and darker than she'd imagined. As she left the library, her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She took a breath and answered, her voice filled with defiance. "You won't win," she said. The voice on the other end was a familiar, hollow whisper. "This is only the beginning, detective. You're in my shadow now." The line went dead, and Evelyn knew the real game had only just begun. Evelyn left the library with a heavy heart, her father's letter clutched tightly in her hand. The shadows in Evergrove weren't just a figment of imagination. They were something real, something ancient that had consumed her father and now threatened to consume her as well. Back at her apartment, she spread out the documents she had gathered on her table, her father's letter at the center. A pattern began to emerge. Each disappearance wasn't random. Each victim had a hidden connection, something they'd tried to bury or forget. The shadow collector preyed on secrets, feeding off guilt, shame, and buried truths. And now, Evelyn knew, it had set its sights on her. The shadows felt closer than ever as she traced her finger over a map of the town, marking each location connected to the disappearances. The pattern was unmistakable. Each point formed a near-perfect circle, centered around the forest on the edge of town, a place called Blackwood Grove. It was a place she'd avoided since she was a child, a place her father had warned her never to go. But if the shadow collector was hiding there, she had no choice. Armed with a flashlight, her father's letter, and her resolve, Evelyn ventured into the dense, tangled forest. The towering trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach for her as she walked deeper into the heart of Blackwood Grove. The farther she went, the quieter the world became, as though the forest itself held its breath in anticipation. Finally, she reached a clearing where an old decrepit cabin stood, half buried in overgrown vines. Its windows were shattered, and the wood was rotting, but she could sense something alive within it. She took a deep breath, steeling herself as she pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick, stale, and heavy with an unnatural darkness. Her flashlight flickered, casting brief, erratic beams that barely illuminated the room. Dust coated every surface, and old photographs lined the walls, each one faded and haunting. As she looked closer, she realized these were the same photographs from the files, images of each victim, taken just before they disappeared. Her heart raced as she spotted her own photo among them, taped near the center. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the far corner of the room, partially cloaked in shadow. Its form was twisted, like a silhouette that didn't quite belong to this world. The shadow collector. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn's voice wavered, but she stood her ground. The figure's hollow voice echoed through the room, each word sending a chill down her spine. "I am not bound by life or death, detective. I exist in the spaces between, in the darkness people hide within themselves. Your father tried to stop me, but he underestimated the power of secrets, just like you." She clenched her fists, defiance flaring in her chest. "He didn't fail. He kept you at bay all these years. But I'm not here to hide. I'm here to end this." The shadow collector's laughter was cold, a sound that seemed to resonate from every dark corner of the cabin. "You cannot defeat what you refuse to face. Are you willing to look into your own darkness, Evelyn, to confront the secrets you've buried?" The question lingered, cutting through her resolve. Her father's letter, the sacrifices he'd made to protect her, weighed heavily on her. She hadn't realized how much she'd buried over the years, the pain of losing him, her fear of returning to Evergrove, her guilt over things left unsaid. She forced herself to hold the shadow's gaze, refusing to look away. "Yes," she whispered, the word filled with a quiet strength. "I'm ready." In an instant, the darkness surged around her, swallowing the room in a suffocating wave. She felt herself falling, sinking into a place where time and reality blurred. Memories surfaced. Her father's laughter, the warmth of her childhood home, the grief that had followed his death. Each memory felt like a step deeper into the shadows, forcing her to confront every piece of herself she'd hidden away. Then, as quickly as it began, the darkness receded. She found herself standing alone in the cabin, the shadow collector gone. Its presence faded like smoke. The photographs on the walls had vanished, replaced by a single-framed picture on the table, her father, smiling at her, his eyes full of pride. A wave of relief washed over her as she realized what she had done. By facing her own fears, her own shadows, she had robbed the Shadow Collector of its power. She had broken the cycle that had held Evergrove captive for so long. Outside, dawn was breaking, casting the first light she'd seen in Blackwood Grove in years. She took a deep breath, the weight of years of darkness finally lifting. As she walked back to town, Evelyn felt her father's presence beside her, a quiet reassurance that she had done what he couldn't. The Shadow Collector was gone, and she knew deep down that Evergrove's secrets would no longer haunt her. Weeks had passed since Evelyn's confrontation with the Shadow Collector in Blackwood Grove, and life in Evergrove had slowly begun to return to normal. The townsfolk who once avoided the old forest now felt a strange peace around it, and the stories that haunted the town gradually faded into memory, taking on a different kind of quiet legend. Evelyn had resumed her work as Evergrove's detective, but she was no longer the Sumps person. She walked through the town with a lighter heart, as though a dark cloud had finally lifted. The files of the missing, the ones who had been taken by the Shadow Collector, were now safely closed, each name honored in a quiet ceremony, their photographs finally put to rest. One afternoon, as Evelyn was organizing her office, a small package arrived. It bore no return address, and the handwriting on the label was neat, almost delicate. She carefully opened it, finding an old, leather-bound journal inside. She recognized it immediately. It was her father's. A note was tucked between the pages, a single line written in his familiar handwriting. "To my brave Evelyn, for when the shadows are gone." She flipped through the journal, reading his last entries, discovering more about the battles he'd fought, both external and internal. In one of his final passages, he'd written about his wish to keep her safe, and his belief that one day she would find the strength to overcome the darkness herself. As she read, Evelyn felt a profound sense of closure. Her father's fears, his struggles, they were now part of her history, but no longer her burden. She closed the journal, holding it close, and made her way to the edge of Blackwood Grove one final time. There she laid the journal beneath an old oak tree, letting it rest in the place that had seen so much darkness, and finally, so much light. As she stood, she could almost feel her father's presence beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his spirit finally at peace. The shadows in Evergrove had been put to rest. Evelyn turned away from the grove, her heart full of resolve, knowing she'd closed the final chapter. The past no longer held her, and she was free to walk forward into the light of a new beginning.